for joining me today. We're continuing our study of Hosea this week and taking a look at chapters 4 through 7. Let's go ahead and pray as we get started. God, thank you so much for this day. We thank you for the changing of the seasons, and we thank you for the time that we get to continue come together and read your word and study it. I pray that as we read these passages in Hosea, that you will illuminate them for us and teach us something of yourself, God. We love you and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we are back to Hosea this week, and we are going to be looking at chapters 4 through 7. Our Sunday school curriculum is really going to zero in on chapter 6 specifically. But I wanted to give us a good overview of each one of these chapters. There's some very interesting messages and some very interesting use of imagery. We've talked about Hosea's use of imagery. Last week we saw a lot about the imagery using prostitution and marriage and adultery to illustrate the broken nature of Israel's relationship with God. And so we're going to see a little bit more of that image, but we're also going to see some other images. And so we're going to zero in on some of that. We're not going to read every single word in all of these chapters. We're going to hit a few high points and summarize some of the things in each one of them. And so hopefully it'll give us a really good overview of this whole section. So one of the things we will see in this section is, if you remember, Hosea kind of mixes together messages of judgment. We see messages of accusation, like God bringing accusations or evidence against the people, saying they have done these things. And we also see messages of hope. And we did see some hope last week. Now, this section we're reading today, it's really more almost solely focused on judgment and accusation. There's not as much of the hopeful language that we saw, but it's not gone forever. We'll see it again as we're reading Hosea. But that is kind of where we are. We're in a judgment part of this book. So let's go ahead and start off here in Hosea 4. Now, Hosea 4 is going to start off with almost this lawsuit imagery or in a message of judgment, almost as if it's an indictment. So it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land." And so we see, that's the first verse of chapter 4. And so the Lord has a charge to bring. So this lawsuit imagery here, and God is going to bring charges. And so what are those charges that God is bringing against the people? And if you remember, Hosea's message is pretty much almost solely focused and addressed to the northern kingdom, even though we're going to see Judah mentioned several times. We saw, I'm pretty sure we saw Judah mentioned last week. I know we're going to see Judah mentioned in our passages for today. But still, his message was delivered to the northern kingdom. So the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. So against those who live in the land. And then it's going to keep going. "There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed." And it says, "Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away." So we see the charges here. We see there's no faithfulness. So people are being unfaithful, disloyal. There is no love. They are not loving God. They're not loving each other. We know the prophets are often rail against the people for their treatment of other people. And then we also see no acknowledgement of God. So they didn't know God. So no acknowledgement of God. This isn't just saying, yeah, I've heard of that guy. This is the idea of like knowing God. So knowing God in the way, it's like knowing God in a way that we are responding to him rightly. And that we know in the context here for the people of Israel, it meant upholding the covenant, being faithful to the covenant that God had made with them at Mount Sinai with Moses. And it says, instead of those things, there's cursing and lying and murder and stealing and adultery, and they break all bounds, and there's bloodshed and more bloodshed. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. And so God is bringing a charge against the people. But it's not going to just stay there, because one of the unique things about chapter 4 is God's going to go on and bring a specific charge or charges against the leaders and the priests. So let's see what God has to say. I'm going to start reading in verse 4 and read down through verse 9. It says, "But let no one bring a charge, let no one accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. You stumble day and night, and the prophets stumble with you. So I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priest. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I will also ignore your children. The more priests there were, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. And it will be like people, like priests, I will punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their deeds." And so we see here that the religious leaders and the priests led the people astray. They allowed this abhorrent false worship to come into the land. And it says, people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. They didn't know God. They didn't know the way they were supposed to do things. They did not, because the priests were leading them astray. The more priests there were, the more they sinned against God. And they exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. And we know in the context of the northern kingdom, they built 2 golden calves. Jeroboam the first had 2 golden calves built, and one of them was at Bethel, and they were worshiping the golden calves. Repeat what happened in Exodus when Moses was up on the mountain. It's just very interesting. And I remember we talked about that in 1st and 2nd Kings, and we read it, and we went back and read in Exodus, and we were like, it's just like history repeating itself. Did they not learn from the first time? So that's what we see here. They exchanged God, the one true, glorious, awesome God, for a golden calf, for an idol made by human hands. And if we keep reading further, and starting in verse 10, we see prostitution come back up. It talks about the people engaging in prostitution because they've deserted the Lord to give themselves to prostitution. Sold a wooden idol, that's down in verse 12, and a diviner's rod speaks to them. A spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They are unfaithful to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and burn offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters turn to prostitution, your daughters-in-law to adultery. The people have prostituted themselves with idols instead of worshiping the one true God. So we see this prostitution metaphor for false worship, for worshiping idols here. And they will be held accountable for that. There is no message of hope in this chapter, because it's going to continue on and talk about how they commit adultery. And even though they've committed adultery, and that they're stubborn, and that they're joined to idols, and that a whirlwind, verse 19, a whirlwind will sweep them away, and their sacrifices will bring them shame. So they are not going to be allowed to continue. They are going to be punished for these sins of false worship. And we know, we've talked about this a lot, they were told the consequences up front. We can read those in Deuteronomy, we can read them in Leviticus. What are the consequences for not upholding the covenant, for not worshiping the Lord their God? And the covenant curses, we can read those. They knew the consequences, or they should have known, perhaps I should say that. Because we know when King Josiah found the book of the law in the temple, he was so distraught by what it said. We can only imagine what he was reading at that time. He was realizing what was going to come down on them. And here we see it with the northern kingdom. And one other note as we are moving ahead to chapter 5 is whenever you see Ephraim in this section, you can think of that as synonymous to the northern kingdom of Israel. It is one of the major tribes there. And you can see it as being synonymous with that whole kingdom. And in Ephraim, the tribal land of Ephraim included Bethel and Samaria. And so some of those major centers of worship and major centers of rulers were in Ephraim. And so it's kind of synonymous with the whole region. So we're going to move on to chapter 5. And what we're going to get is more judgment. And it's going to start here right off the bat. In verse 1, hear this, you priests. Pay attention, you Israelites. Listen, royal house. This judgment is against you. So we are hearing another judgment is being brought against pretty much the entire nation. Priests are mentioned, the people, the Israelites are mentioned, and the royal house. So priests, rulers, and people are all mentioned here. And then it's going to go on and lay out why they are being judged here. We get a bit of a trial scene here. So let's look down starting in verse 4. It says, their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. A spirit of prostitution is in their heart. They do not acknowledge the Lord. Israel's arrogance testifies against them. The Israelites, even Ephraim, stumble in their sin. Judah also stumbles with them. And it says, so it's like this, their very actions, their very deeds are testifying against them. So their accusation here is that they are not, that the spirit of prostitution is in their heart. They are being led astray to worship other gods. They're choosing to worship idols instead of the one true God. They stumble in their sin. And we see Judah mentioned here. And if we were to have read all of chapter 4, Judah's mentioned at the end of there too. But Judah stumbles with them. So Judah's not immune to this. And we know that because we know what happens whenever Babylon comes. And so we see that their very actions are preventing them from returning to their God. They are too far gone, and there's nothing that they can do to turn back. They're continuing to persist in living wrongly, living against the covenant that they made with God and choosing to worship idols. And then verse 6 is particularly poignant to me. It says, when they go to their flocks and herds to seek the Lord, they will not find him. He has withdrawn himself from them. And I think that's so interesting because whenever we are thinking about punishment, we might be thinking, oh, fire and brimstone is going to just rain down from heaven. But what God does instead is just withdraw himself from them. So the people of Israel are supposed to be God's unique special treasure, a unique representation of God's relationship with people. God had a special, unique relationship with them. He dwells in the temple. That's why they built the temple there. He was going to dwell in that temple. His presence was going to be there in Jerusalem. You remember we read through Ezekiel. There's that scene where Ezekiel is whisked away to Jerusalem in a vision, and he's seeing God's presence leaving the temple and leaving the city. So God is withdrawing himself from the people. And when God's presence is absent, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to open them up to attack from the outside, to open them up to be just completely sent out in exile. All of those things because God is no longer with them. They were supposed to be a people known for God being with them. And they were choosing to live as though God wasn't with them. So God said, okay, I'm going to withdraw myself from you and not be with you. And now let's see what's going to happen. This disaster is coming. It's inevitable. And it's going to be political disaster, meaning they're going to come in and we know the Assyrians are going to come in and just decimate the northern kingdom and conquer and do away with the kingdom of Israel. And if we were to look in the pages of history, starting around at verse 8 here, the background here would be what's known as the Syro-Ephraimite War. And that we see a little bit of that mentioned. We read about it in 2 Kings. If you look in 15 and 16, we see this rise of Assyria is becoming stronger and stronger. And so the king of Israel, Pekah, formed this alliance with the king of Syria. And they wanted to be against the Assyrians. And they tried to convince Judah to join them. And Judah didn't want to join. King Jotham, I believe, was the king at the time. And he didn't want to join. Well, then he died. And King Ahaz came to power in Judah. And he also didn't want to join up with the northern kingdom. Instead, he appealed directly to Assyria for help. And Assyria came in. And they wiped out and decimated Syria. And then they came to the northern kingdom, and they also paid tribute. And then we see Israel's king Hosea being installed as the last king of Israel. And so we hear some of that in in Hosea's words here. So from a date perspective, this is definitely happening in the twilight of the northern kingdom. So around 734 to 732 BC. And we're going to see this cycle of assassinations. It ends a lot of the kings in Israel. And then you get to the last one, Hosea. So that's kind of a little bit of the background here. I think that's kind of helpful to see as we move through this book. There's some historical background that kind of helps us understand what's happening. And as we look at the end of chapter 5, down in verse 14, we see God being described as a lion. For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, like a great lion to Judah. I will tear them to pieces and go away. I will carry them off with no one to rescue them. Then I will return to my lair until they have borne their guilt and seek my face. In their misery, they will earnestly seek me. So we look at these two verses. Well, it's really bleak. Just a picture in Israel and Judah. Really, it's just a bleak picture. The judgment is coming and it's inevitable. And then this picture of God going back to his lair and just waiting, knowing that at some point the people are going to seek him out of their misery. And then I think it's very interesting because the very next thing that happens is in chapter 6, starts off, we hear from the people, not necessarily the people are speaking, but perhaps God is saying this is what the people should say. I'm going to read the first 3 verses. It says, "Come and let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the 3rd day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth." So we see here almost a call to repentance, a call to turn to God, to return to the Lord. So I like it because verse 15, just above, talked about the people turning to God in their misery. And then we see that in the first 3 verses here in chapter 6. And there's this, so it's like this call to repentance, perhaps a word of, this is how we should respond to God. Knowing that God would bind up their wounds, that he would restore them in verse 2, that they would live in his presence, be able to have him with them. Because we talked about back up in 5 verse 6, God withdrawing himself from the people. We see him returning to his lair in verse 15, that he's leaving them until they are earnestly and authentically looking for him, to return to him. And that's what we see here in these first few verses. What does that authentic return look like? Living in his presence. Acknowledge the Lord. Know the Lord. Knowing the Lord. Responding to God rightly. Responding to God in upholding his covenant. Responding to God in praise and worship. Right worship. Let us press on to acknowledge him. So not just know him once, but to continually know him over and over again. More and more. As the sun rises, he will appear. So and this word that God will respond to this authentic return or calling out to him. As sure as the sun rises, he will come. It's a certainty. Come like the winter rains, the spring rains that water the earth. And so it says the winter rains and the spring rains, and this idea that so like the winter rains it might have said the latter rains, and the general rain and the latter rains would be another way to kind of look at it, rain and latter rain. So the spring rain would have been the rain that helps the grain mature and so that it can withstand the summer heat. So you have the initial rain, and then you have the rain that's going to really bring the nutrients and the water that the grain was going to need to endure the long days of summer. It's such a beautiful image here. And I love how here we have this authentic return and this authentic response, and that God will come whenever the people do that. And in some ways, it's answering this charge that we saw here at the beginning of chapter 4. The Lord has a charge to bring against you. There's no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. And so the response then is to know God. The response is to live in his presence and to be certain of his work in their midst. And then we get to verse 4, and there's a little bit of a shift here, and then God is the one speaking again. It says, "What can I do with you, Ephraim? What can I do with you, Judah? Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears. Therefore I cut you in pieces with my prophets. I killed you with the words of my mouth. Then my judgments go forth like the sun, for I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings." I hear in these verses just a bit of exasperation of like, what can I do? Like God wanting to be long-suffering and patient and not acting and responding in anger, but wanting, but expecting that loyalty, but we're receiving in return love that evaporates like the morning mist. One day last week, Aaron and I were out running early in the morning, and the sun was just coming up, and it was one of the days that it was particularly humid, and there was a thick layer of mist and fog that was really low to the ground, and it was rolling across the park, and you could see it, and it was just so thick. But as the sun started to come up above the horizon, that mist just evaporated, and it was just all of a sudden. And we were running down one edge of the park, and then we turned to go down another. And by the time we got to the other end of the park, which maybe was just a span of like it was probably more like 2 or 3 minutes, most of the mist had evaporated and was gone. So it didn't take very long. So that is the imagery here. The morning mist, as the sun is coming up, it evaporates almost immediately. It disappears almost immediately. That is what their love is compared to. The people in Israel and Judah, the people of God that he brought out of Egypt and traveled with through the wilderness and brought into the land and gave them their own special promised land that had been promised all the way back in the time of Abraham. Those people had love for God that evaporated as easily as the mist in the morning. But God doesn't just get mad and say, okay, be done with it, right? Instead, he sent his prophets. And his prophet, Hosea is a prophet, right? He's sending prophets. We saw some of the prophets when we were reading through 1st and 2nd Kings. We're reading some of the other prophets. We've also read Isaiah and Ezekiel. We've read a lot of the prophets. God sent a lot of prophets to the people to warn them, to call them back. But they didn't. They didn't listen. They did not respond humbly. They did not respond and in a knowing God way. They didn't live in his presence. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and an acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. It's not that God's saying do away with all of the sacrificial system. He's saying that you're doing these works, but there's no relationship, no heart. It's just a sacrifice. And a dead animal on a fire. If there's no heart change, no commitment, no devotion. That's what God is saying here. The people chose to just do some actions and not actually follow God and have a relationship with him. Their love evaporated. You read through the Psalms and you think about all of the ascent Psalms, where you have the Psalms of Ascent, where the people are going up to Jerusalem. I might say, we're going to the Mount of Zion, or different ways of talking about that. And you hear all the joy and the just wonderful music and the clanging cymbals and all of the different things you read and the people praising God. I think of all of that. And I think that's what's missing in their worship. Well, one, they're worshiping idols, but also their worship of God was not filled with the things that it was supposed to. It had just become some sacrifices they did, and God was just another one of the things they offered sacrifices to, because they wanted to hedge their bets and let's sacrifice to this one, this God or that God, so we can make sure that our bases are covered. So we continue in chapter 6, and we see that violence is what's reigning in the land. It says, as at Adam they have broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me there. Gilead is a city of evildoers, stained with footprints of blood. As marauders lie in ambush for a victim, so do bands of priests. They murder on the road to Shechem, carrying out their wicked schemes. I have seen a horrible thing in Israel. There Ephraim is given to prostitution. Israel is defiled. Also for you, Judah, a harvest is appointed. You have this picture of just violence in different places, violence done by priests, carrying out wicked schemes. Again, it's prostitution imagery here. But then verse 11 is so interesting because it talks about a harvest is appointed for Judah. And this isn't just a fruitful harvest of, oh, this is some great stuff you're going to harvest. No, this is a harvest of judgment. Judgment awaits Judah as well. And I told you at the beginning of today, Judah's not going to escape, even though most of Hosea's message is to the northern kingdom. And then we come to chapter 7. Well, I guess the second half of verse 11. I'm going to read a little bit more. Whenever I would restore the fortunes of my people, whenever I would heal Israel, the sins of Ephraim are exposed and the crimes of Samaria revealed. They practice deceit. Thieves break into houses. Bandits rob in the streets, but they do not realize that I remember all their evil deeds. Their sins engulf them. They are always before me. They delight the king with their wickedness, the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, burning like an oven, whose fire the baker need not stir, from the kneading of the dough till it rises. And we have this contrast here between a God who desires to save, a God who wants to restore and heal, and then people who are just being engulfed by sin. And so much so they're delighting the king with their wickedness and the princes with their lies, with their actions, serving the king of Israel, but not serving their true king. Their loyalty, their allegiance is divided. It's in the wrong place. And then we see this other image here, this image of an oven and this baking of bread. And this oven and baking imagery is going to carry on a little bit further into chapter 7. But let's talk about it right here. It changes its meaning a little bit as we go. So in verse 4, it says they're burning like an oven. So they are, it's an oven that has been overheated so that it doesn't need any stirring to keep it hot. So that it would just like cook immediately whenever it's put in. So they are committing evil and doing all of these sins with such great zeal. Nothing's having to stir it up. It's just right there at the ready. And the baker didn't have to do anything as he or she was preparing the dough and waiting for it to rise. The fire was already ready in the oven. And then we see in these next set of verses, more oven imagery here. And it talks about the day of the festival of our king. Princes became inflamed with wine, and he joins hands with the mockers, and their hearts are like an oven. They approach him with intrigue. Their passion smolders all night. And in the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are as hot as an oven. They devour their rulers, all their kings fall, and none of them calls on me. And you just get this picture. We know how the kingdom of Israel, the last several kings, and really a lot of the kings, there was a cycle of a lot of assassination that took place. And this, there were 4 kings assassinated from 746 to 732, with Micah being the last one there being assassinated. So it was Zechariah, Shallum, Pekahiah, and Pekah. They were all assassinated, and they didn't rule for very long. So you get this idea of this smoldering flame, and their kings fell, but none of them called on God. And then starting here in verse 8, we're going to see more baking metaphors, but it's going to turn a little bit different. So Ephraim mixes with the nations. Ephraim is a flat loaf, not turned over. Foreigners sap his strength, but he does not realize it. His hair is sprinkled with gray, but he does not notice. Israel's arrogance testifies against him. But despite all of this, he does not return to the Lord his God or search for him. So Ephraim is a flat loaf that's not turned over. So the idea is that it's burning on one side from being overexposed to the heat and not cooking all the way through. And so the metaphor here is that Israel is mixing with the other nations, turning to the other nations, and not getting its energy and its protection and all of what it needs from God. So they're turning to other nations rather than to God for help. In verse 11, it says, Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless, now calling to Egypt, now turning to Assyria. And so just talking about, we think about Israel and the Israelites, they've been trying to go back to Egypt from the beginning. That was what they wanted to do whenever they encountered their first trouble. Oh, we should have gone back to Egypt because at least we had food, or at least we had whatever it was. And it's like they just are continuing to turn to others instead of turning to the God who brought them out of Egypt, who brought them across the Red Sea, who brought them to Mount Sinai, who brought them across the wilderness, who brought them into the land, and had worked many marvelous, miraculous things in their midst. And they still wanted to turn to others. They were not being baked fully with God. The other metaphor that we saw up here was comparing Ephraim to an old man who is whose hair is turning gray, but he doesn't notice it. That's kind of funny. So this idea that Israel's vitality and youth is draining away. It's in its twilight years, and we know that because it's not going to last very much longer. And we see Ephraim being like a dove that is easily deceived. So meaning they make political alliances randomly. Then we see a little further God saying, when they go, I will throw my net over them. I will pull them down like the birds in the sky. When I hear them flocking together, I will catch them. So catching them with a net, like you would catch birds, like a way they would hunt. So let's finish out this chapter. Woe to them because they have strayed from me. Destruction to them because they have rebelled against me. I long to redeem, but they speak about me falsely. They do not cry out to me from their hearts, but wail on their beds. They slash themselves, appealing to their gods for grain and new wine, but they turn away from me. I trained them and strengthened their arms, but they plot evil against me. They do not turn to the Most High. They are like a faulty bow. Their leaders will fall by the sword because of their insolent words. For this, they will be ridiculed in the land of Egypt. Punishment is inevitable at this point. God longs to redeem, but is prevented from doing so because they've strayed. They've rebelled, they've strayed. They do not cry out to me from their hearts. They slash themselves, appealing to other gods. Remember the prophets on Mount Carmel with Elijah? And how they started slashing themselves to get his attention, to get him to light the fire on their altar. But God trained them, he strengthened them, and they plot evil against him. And that is where Hosea leaves us today. What a bleak picture. There really wasn't much hope. I mean, I guess we could talk about those first 3 verses of chapter 6, where you have kind of like this call to be repentant and that confidence that God would respond. But for the most part, Hosea 4 through 7 are pretty bleak, laying out what the people have done and what they continue to do, and how God is just withdrawing himself from them, and they are going to reap the consequences for their actions. I hope you will join me again next week when we're going to be looking at the next 3 chapters. We are at our halfway point in our study of Hosea, and so I hope I'll see you next week. Bye!